what's going to happen is you're going to keep working on your rendering skills. So here you can see I've added reflection onto the ground here, which I think adds, makes the rendering much more dynamic. So we'll talk about that. But you can maybe notice a difference in the rendering quality between this, minus the background. So if I do a side by side, I'll try to do a side by side here. Where is it? So you might be able to notice some differences here. Maybe it's not quite obvious in this view, but the lighting is a bit softer, I would say. There's reflections. Maybe there's a better view. This one the zoom in will definitely show the difference between the two. So what you submitted for today, those aren't actually rendered, right? That is just more of a preview in Rhino. So we're going to talk about a method of rendering your viewport. So here, similar views, but you can definitely see a lighting difference, right? It's the same. The settings are the same, right? But the quality of the rendering is much different between the two. So this is just Rhino capturing the rendered view. And this is using ray trace, which is a type of rendering capability that Rhino has that uses your GPU. And it's also real-time rendering. So that means that as you're working and you're updating, it will update in real time a render of the object or the environment. So you can see that the texture map also looks a bit different, maybe a bit more realistic, not as jaggedy or pixelated. Because again, what you're seeing in the Rhino rendered view is more of a preview. So you're seeing a reduced version of the render, or like what you would be rendering. And it's set up that way so that it's easier to work in, right? Because if you were, you can see, I'll show you the difference between working in the two, but, the rendered view is a faster way of viewing texture and lighting, but it's not going to be necessarily accurate. How to get rid of, so I think I went over this briefly in last week, but basically each display option, you have the ability to modify the characteristics of each type of display mode. So for instance, so you can see each one, right? There's rendered, ghosted. These are all the different display modes that you can switch in your viewport. So if you select one, there's all these subcategories where you can start to modify the settings. For instance, for shadows, where I showed you how to modify your shadows, that's in rendered view. So you want to be aware that you need to have rendered selected if you want to see the shadows, um, to adjust the clarity of the shadows in that view. So here you can modify the shadows, make them sharper, blur the edges. In rendered view, there are also visibility options. So, for instance, show curves. I don't have any curves on. Let's see, tangent edges. This is usually where you would be able to, edge thickness. So this is, if you're seeing your edges in this view, that means probably this is set to something, and that's where you would want to modify that. This is also where you can modify the settings for your clipping plane. So you can change the color of the fill that you'll see or the outline. Okay. Now let's get into lighting. Okay, so I want to talk more specifically about the specific options for rendering and setting up your environment. So, so what you're seeing right now is my rendering environment, right? So this ground plane, this surface you're seeing right now, if you're having trouble and your shadows aren't changing and when you're modifying the properties, that probably usually when that was the problem, it's because you weren't on the right display mode option. So make sure you have rendered selected and you're in the shadows. And then if you're still, you might need to exit out of it for it to fully update. But that is the way to get better shadows. Okay. All right. So you're seeing my, my rendering environment. You can see that I've modified the ground plane. So now it's a different material, or has different surface qualities than the background that you see. So that background, so this gradient view is just a default setting, right? So I can have it be a solid color. I can add a gradient color, or if I go to the 360 environment, so this is the studio environment. Let me turn my ground plane off. So what you're seeing is, again, a default 360 environment that Rhino gives you. But you can see what's happening here. There's these two light panels that are illuminating my model, right, on two sides. So that's how you're getting consistent lighting. But usually you don't really want to see that background, so that's why you change it to a color, a gradient, or you can put a custom image. So we'll just keep that on the ground plane here. Let's see. So what I'll run through first is what happens when I start to turn these things off. So here I have my ground plane, right? And if I turn on and off this custom environment for reflection, my ground plane is picking up the lighting effect of the studio environment, right? So you're seeing the light panel right now. That's where there. And again, this is not actually rendered, so that's why you're seeing it like that. But once I render it, it shouldn't necessarily look like that. And we'll see the difference once we move into ray trace. We'll eventually talk about lights, but you can also add lights to get more detailed lighting. But here is, the lighting tab down here. You really want to make sure that all of these are on. So you can see what this looks like. It doesn't look great. I turned that off. And you're seeing the ground plane like this. Okay. So that's no lighting settings at all. This is just the default in rendered view. So if your model looks like this, so you can see, doesn't look great. But